So, welcome everyone, and I'm very, very thankful for the privilege of your time today when we are talking about the changes or the implications of the UK foreign policy in the Middle East. And joining us, we have Professor Scott Lucas, who is a professor of American Studies, a specialist in US and British foreign policy. His research interests also cover current and international affairs, especially North Africa, Middle East, Iran, new media, and intelligence services. Most importantly, he's the founder of and the editor of EA Worldview, one of the leading news and analysis sites on US foreign policy and international affairs, especially in the Middle East. EA Worldview is now established as a day to day leader in coverage of conflict, sitting alongside and sometimes ahead of CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera. Professor Lucas is a frequent contributor to American, British, and international media. In fact, even in Indian. He is a member of the advisory board of the Center for American Studies and Research at American University at Beirut, and he has been adjunct professor of the Institute for North American and European Studies at the University of Tehran. If I continue speaking about him, the entire 1 hour will go away. So I will just cut it short now and go to my first question with Professor Scott, which is that could you please tell us what exactly was happening 2 to 3 days before in UK, which has been termed specifically as far-right protests, but what exactly was happening over there?
Thanks for asking that. And it's interesting that I did one interview with an Indian outlet a few days, well, a couple of days ago. And I start off with the points that I start off with them for the discussion. I think the first is to emphasize that um, these are not large demonstrations in the UK. This is not like 10,000s, even thousands of people protesting about an issue, let's say like immigration, or about economic issues or social issues. These are pockets of, at most, a few hundred people, almost all of them white men. And in these cases, these people are not really there to protest, they are there seeking confrontation. Sometimes they're seeking confrontation with the police, sometimes they're seeking confrontation with against those in communities, especially Muslims. And sometimes they're seeking out refugees and asylum seekers, not just migrants, to threaten them, to intimidate them. So, in one of the most serious incidents, a couple of days ago, they broke into a hotel and they tried to set fire to it. This is a hotel that was sheltering asylum seekers. So this is not, quite often you'll hear the term of anti-immigration protest. Now we're not really, these people are using the excuse of immigration to go out and seek confrontation and to pursue an agenda, which I have to say, which for many of them is a white nationalist agenda. You will hear the phrase, take back our country, or you will hear the phrase, England or the English. Now, I lived in the UK from 1981 until 6 months ago when I moved to Ireland. In the 1980s, when I first came to the UK, this was happening. This was happening with groups like the National Front, as it was then known, eventually becomes the English Defence League, and they were going out and they were targeting ethnic and racial communities, in some cases Asian communities, in some cases Afro-Caribbean communities. They simply were looking for racial confrontation and to whip up hatred. What makes this different is that we are in the era of social media and a polarized mainstream media. And so, as this occurs here, and in a post Brexit environment, let me add that as well, is that in 2016, those issues around immigration, which were already there, became part of the Brexit movement, who exploited them to say we have to leave the EU. And a lot of the rhetoric that was used then was used to target people from South Asia, people from Middle East, people from North Africa as being threats. And there were posters up with them, all these threats. So that rhetoric's been running for years. with the expansion of social media and with, in this case, a catalyst, which is someone who owns X, I'll still call it Twitter, Elon Musk, who is willing to amplify these messages, you get a support for these pockets of protesters by claiming that these are just legitimate protests. They're just reflecting issues. It's the police who are at fault here. It's the left who are at fault. It's the Labor government who are at fault. It's the Muslims who are at fault. And why we say Muslims rather than, for example, the Hindu community is that because, of course, about issues that we're going to talk about involving the Middle East, that it is much easier to target Muslims than it is to target Hindus in terms of the arguments that these are the enemy. Something I can talk about in further detail if you want to. The other thing
Uh,
about this,
yeah,
let me just highlight one other thing is, and it is not just social media. What is very important to realize here is that, and I know we've talked a little bit about the polarization of Indian media as well.
yeah,
That is happening in the UK. There are two national networks. One is called GB News, who I just came off air with because I'll go in there and challenge them. But I was talking to them about the vice president, the vice presidential nominee. So I
yeah.
just came off with it. But GB News and Talk TV, who both support the far right protest. They don't just excuse them, they support them, they cover for them. One of the politicians who has been spreading disinformation is a man named Nigel Farage.
Yeah. Yes. That's
Now
his
you
job
know
for as much as long as
that's
I
his
know
job.
him. Yeah.
He's done it for many years. He's
Yeah.
done it for many years, but
Yep.
here's the difference now. Nigel Farage, his latest party that he created a few years ago is called the Reform Party.
Yeah.
It is a hard right party. It's really a hard right party, which is a personal vehicle at this point. They did get 5 MPs at the last election, but only 5. That's out of, let me just remind myself, 650 in the UK Parliament.
Okay.
But he makes a lot of noise. He has his own program on GB News where he gets to talk for a couple of hours every night unchecked. Now, imagine if you had a member of the Indian Parliament,
Yeah.
the Assembly, who could do that for 2 hours every night. That's what we have here. As soon as we had the incident, which was the catalyst for these riots, which were the killing of 3 girls
Yeah.
by a 17-year-old near
Yeah.
Liverpool,
Yeah.
he went on air and said, they're not telling us what happened. They're not telling us what happened. In other words, spreading disinformation that an immigrant was responsible, which was not true.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it is the combination of this hard right party reform, Mr. Farage in particular,
Yeah.
and social media who are supporting and amplifying the riots.
Yeah.
Their latest message they put out, by the way, which is a very dangerous message, is they are now targeting the police. They are now arguing that there's a two-tier police system in the UK where the police go soft on, for example, Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
They go soft on the left,
Okay.
including pro-Palestinian protests, but they're very, very mean to these far-right protesters. That's what they mean by two-tier policing.
Okay.
Imagine how dangerous that message is if it starts to spread and people pick up on it, because you now have made not just Muslims, you've made police the enemy.
Yeah.
And just a quick reminder here, the latest message from Elon Musk, he's done two. One is that the UK is on the verge of civil war, which is
Yeah.
untrue.
Hmm.
And two, that the United Kingdom is just like the Soviet Union, which is also
Wow.
untrue.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, but what it can be predicted from the pattern of behavior of Nigel Farage, specifically because he has strong connections with the Republican Party in the US. And he has been a strong supporter of Trump. So many Republicans had invested financially in Brexit to happen. And this kind of, at the same time, the cost of migration and the cost of asylum seekers and the cost of the refugees that are there in UK right now is obviously overwhelming. But at the same time, the government has played very diplomatically. But the point here is that all the lower level clerical jobs are done by outsiders.
Yeah. Let's take those points up. Those are really important.
Yeah.
The first point, from the standpoint of the connection between the hard right or the far right in the US, in the UK, and by the way, in other countries. I don't think
Yeah.
it's reached India yet in terms of this
We
organization.
never know.
Who never know.
Yeah.
But in this case, Nigel Farage went to work for Donald
Yeah.
Trump in the 2016 campaign.
Yeah.
He worked for Trump. He appeared at rallies on him. Those connections were maintained where initially Farage was going to go and work for Trump this year. And he went over and he initially he wasn't going to stand in the UK general election. And then he flipped course and said, no, I am going to stand because the message came out from the Trump people, we need you over there.
Yeah.
What Farage is trying to do with GB News and to an extent Talk TV is do the same thing that Trump has tried to do by creating a far right media in the United States.
Yeah.
It's not just Fox. It's Breitbart. It's One America, One America Nation, One American News Network, right? And Farage is trying to use that same Trumpian strategy of not dealing with the facts, but putting out the scare messages, which leads me to the second point, which is here's a couple of facts on immigration and on refugees and on asylum seekers. First of all, immigrants are a net benefit to the UK economy.
Yeah.
Because, of course, when you talk about immigrants who then come over here and they then wind up getting jobs, as you pointed out, working in a lot of public service sectors, they pay taxes.
Yeah.
They buy goods. They are net benefits. Yeah. Now, there's immediate pinch points, which is how do you provide housing for asylum seekers and refugees? How do you provide health care? There's all those issues. But that's an infrastructure problem. That's not a problem of immigrants per se, who are taking all of our money, right? Secondly, 90% of the net migration into the UK, 90% is legal migration amongst two groups, students and employees. And a lot of those students and employees come from which country? Probably the number one country for legal migration into the UK?
India.
Yeah. India, right? So, in fact, if you follow the logic of what they try to say, the far right, they're saying that Indians are the big drain on the UK economy. And you and I both know that's not true.
Rishi Sunak became the prime minister.
Well, yeah, okay. Yeah. I think Liz Truss was an even greater drain than Rishi Sunak, but that's a valid point. Yeah. So that's the context for what we're talking about here. And what I'd really encourage everybody out there is to get beyond the headlines. Yeah. Because, in journalism, if it bleeds, it leads. So the headlines are going to be the confrontation. To get in on the issues that are both what the immediate attempt by the Labor government is to try to deal with this, and then the wider issues around infrastructure, around the question of immigration and asylum seekers, and indeed the whole question of the UK legal system. Because here's the other thing that you will not hear on the far right, right? The reason why there's been an increased problem in dealing with the small boats, who are the undocumented immigrants and the refugees, asylum seekers crossing the channel. The reason for that is not that there's been a sudden huge surge in those boat crossings. They've been going on for years. Yeah. The problem here is that when the UK left the EU, the UK left a coordinated border security system. Yeah. When you're in the EU, you could coordinate with the French and with others on what you do about those crossings. When you leave the EU, you've just broken that coordination that takes place. Yeah. So how do you restore that cooperation over the border when you've left the European Union? And that's a question you very rarely hear brought out in the UK press. Specifically, the English Channel being now much more, fragile to any kind of influx of refugees. But UK also needs to understand that the refugees are created by their own mechanisms of involvement in North Africa and Middle East specifically. And
that is something that cannot be taken away from the context. I call it reverse colonialism. But the entire idea that even in 2019, the last time I went to UK, I saw the number of refugees who were there more at Oxford Street and many other like highly populated areas or market areas in central London, lesser in the outskirts. But at the same time, my question now is for a very long time when we thought about David Cameron or we thought about Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak or Boris Johnson and no, Theresa May, we often had this phrase that none of the British politicians know exactly what they're doing.
Yeah.
But coming to Keir Starmer, do you think that the Labour will be uniformed in terms of unity and praxis under his governance right now?
I, if we take the broad question and then we might apply it to foreign policy issues,
Yeah,
I think the reason why Labour had such a landslide, beyond the peculiarities of the UK voting system,
yeah,
first past the post, was that Starmer was able in the past 5 years to remake Labour in terms of a party which was not completely unified,
yeah,
but most of the membership were in line. You might remember in 2019 that when they had the disastrous election, which was the get Brexit done general
yeah,
election,
yeah, yeah,
and the Tories won a majority of 80, which was
yeah,
considered what a big majority. Remember, Labour have a majority of about at least 160
yeah,
now, and I think it may be higher than that. That you know that was a fractured party because it was Jeremy Corbyn who was on the left of the party.
yeah.
But it wasn't just that he was on the left of the party versus the centrists. The party was badly divided because it was not handling the issue of anti-Semitism very effectively, which was tearing it apart. It was not very unified in terms of where it stood on social issues, right? How much, you do put, as it were, tax to build up the NHS, to build up other public services. And it was not unified in terms of that there were a lot of squabbles between different personalities. Uh, there's enough blame to go all around for that, but the big problem actually wasn't Corbyn himself. The big problem was Corbyn's advisors, who were very much not only from the left, but even the far left of the party.
Okay.
Um,
And he was not able to gauge
so
that.
Corbyn, I know Corbyn really well because Corbyn was in the constituency next to mine when I first moved to Britain in
Okay.
Islington, and this is all the way back in the 1980s.
Yeah,
So I've watched him and he's a very honest man.
yeah,
He's a very well-meaning man. He wears his heart on his sleeve, but he can be a very naive man in terms
okay.
of what he goes out and what he says. And I think there's a real naivety amongst Corbyn in terms of certainly there was on Brexit. He did not understand what was happening on Brexit. There's a naivety in terms of social issues that you can't go too far to the left in Britain. You've got to build a consensus first around what you're
Yeah,
doing. And there was a real naivety on foreign policy issues. I'm not saying that you know he would put out messages that were definitely pro Hamas, for example, right? Now, I'm not saying he was
mm,
working for Hamas,
yeah,
but he would put out, and I'm not talking pro Palestinian, I'm talking pro Hamas,
okay.
right? And he wouldn't understand why those messages were not going to be accepted by a lot of people in the UK,
Yeah,
right? And he had advisors who were telling him, go left, go far left on this, right? And he would take it up as an ideological position. Starmer is a pragmatist. Starmer is someone who comes in, he's very much in the center of the party
yeah,
on social issues, economic issues, foreign policy, but he is very much, remember, this guy's a prosecutor, was the top
yeah,
prosecutor in Britain. He's a pragmatist and he's tough.
yeah.
And he and his advisors said, we are effectively going to push the Corbynists out of the party or off to the side. And he was
Okay.
largely effective in doing that. As a result, what you saw is that most of Labor was unified around that Starmer government. When you had the people who challenged Labor, they usually now were no longer in the party. So
Hmm.
Jeremy Corbyn retained his seat, but he did so as an independent.
Yeah, he did,
He
and
got thrown.
yeah,
Yeah, he did retain his seat,
yeah,
and there are and we may talk about this. There were several candidates, most of them are Muslim, who won seats as independents over the Gaza issue,
yeah,
right? But that tended to be in certain constituencies in the UK with very large Muslim populations
yeah,
where they won. Now, I'm not demeaning that. That's fair play. They won in those constituencies.
yeah,
What I'm saying here is that Gaza is not, I think, a national issue that splits labor at this point. At this point, right? And I also think you're going to see the Starmer government very quickly stake out some ground to move it away from Israel.
I
Not
hope
completely.
so. I hope so, but
Well,
yeah,
just to let you know the breaking news. The breaking news, which is out this week, is, and it was coming, the UK has effectively suspended arms exports to Israel. Now, they have not publicly announced this yet because the official position is we are carrying out a review of the way that Israel has conducted the military operations in Gaza,
yeah,
right? And we're pending through. But in fact, the Starmer camp let it be known this week to the
yeah,
media that while that review is going on,
yeah.
there will be no approval of export licenses for UK arms to Israel. Now, that actually, by the way, that actually the UK does not send a large amount of arms to Israel. This is largely a symbolic issue, but it's a hugely important symbolic issue.
But they send more
And
amount of arms to Saudi Arabia then.
I'll give you the comparison.
Yeah,
Since 2010, I think it is, they have sent around 500 million, less than 500 million pounds of arms to Israel. Since 2015, officially, they've sent about 10 billion with a B
yeah,
pounds to Saudi Arabia. And
yeah.
unofficially, arms campaigners say that figure is closer to 29 billion.
Wow,
So 500 million versus 29 billion,
wow.
right? Which tells you that the UK's arms markets are with the Gulf states.
Yeah.
That's where their markets are. They aren't with Israel. But of course, the symbolism of the issue, labor needs to show that it is going to back away from any arms sales to Israel, and that's what I expect them to do in the months to come.
But two things which are very interesting. The first is that UK has not officially recognized the state of Palestine.
Yeah, and I can talk to you about that from the standpoint of here living here in Ireland, right?
Yeah,
Because what has been very interesting, there were several states that had recognized Palestine before
yeah,
last year. Hungary was one of them, which is interesting because Hungary is now actually quite pro-Israeli in its policy, but it already recognized Palestine. Uh, I think there may have been 6 European states. Sweden was another that had recognized them. There were
yeah.
three Europe. There were 3 European states: Ireland, Norway, and either Slovenia or Slovakia. I think it was Slovakia that came
Okay.
out and recognized. And the Irish position was very much we can no longer wait for a state of Palestine. We cannot wait on negotiations brokered by the Americans.
Yeah,
We can no longer wait on some type of United Nations action because the United Nations cannot actually declare a state.
yeah.
We have got to act now, and the Israelis absolutely despise the Irish right now. By the way, and I know this from knowing how the Israeli embassy operates here in Dublin.
Yeah,
The UK government under Labour, the
yeah,
Conservative government was not going to do it. Already, what the Labour government is indicating is we may recognize the state of Palestine before the conclusion of a peace process.
now
Now that's
that's
still a big shift. That's
yeah,
still a big shift because the whole thing is until you get a two-state basically agreement between the Palestinian and Israel, you've tied your hands. You can't recognize, right?
yeah,
Well, they've untied their hands and say it may now be possible. A lot of this depends on how long Netanyahu stays in office. The longer that Netanyahu stays in office, the likelihood is that you got more countries that'll move towards recognizing Palestine, and the UK will be one of them.
I hope so, because UK was a very potential creator of whatever is the geopolitics of Israel and Palestine. But at the same time, even Keir Starmer is now being accused of anti-Semitism, which is a very loaded term. Which anyone who's against the state of Israel is anti-Semitic. There was an Al Jazeera documentary that I watched that how in the Students' Union of Cambridge University and Oxford University, there were many, these funding campaigns going on for
Yeah.
recruiting students at a very young age into the Zionist lobby.
Mm.
So this
But
was 4 or 5 years back. But my question to you is that even Starmer will not be, irrespective of his ties with Israel and many in his cabinet, but he is also going to face the music when it comes to being anti-Semitic. So how is he going to deal with it?
I think I think Starmer will get off that fairly easily because I think, first of all, I mean, his wife's Jewish, for what
Yeah,
that's worth.
yeah,
He's got very close links with the Jewish community. I think
hmm
he's got respect. He's got respect from the mainstream Jewish community in terms of the way he's operated. He's been very supportive of Israel's right to exist, if you want to
yeah,
put it that way, in terms
yeah,
of its security.
yeah,
He certainly has not been, I think he's been far too slow in terms of supporting Gaza civilians. I think he was too slow last autumn to do it. He and the UK were very slow, even to abstain on a ceasefire resolution in the UN, let alone support it. You might remember that whole narrative ran from last autumn
yeah,
all the way through. So I think look, you're right. There's certain the Israeli embassy is going to fire whatever it can at anyone who takes a line that is even slightly divergent from what they will want on this
yeah,
issue,
yeah,
right? Uh, and they will, if, for example, it's confirmed that the UK is suspending arms to Israel, they will step up the allegations of anti Semitism.
yeah,
Um, and I think it's important to call this out because I'll say this for two reasons. I'll say, on the one hand, um, it is important to recognize uh, the propaganda that comes out from the Israelis, right? And from the Israeli government. On the other hand, it's very important to recognize um, when you use a word like anti-Semitism, what the situation here is, and that is, and I'll, first of all, that there are many Jewish people who do not support the stance of
yeah,
the Israeli government,
yeah,
including in Israel, and to go out and to attack Jews as a bloc is frankly irresponsible,
yeah,
which is what the risk is here. And I'd say that specifically, that in the UK, that's a very dangerous, risky position to make. Um, I, by the way, I'll give you a bit of background. I was in a Jewish fraternity. A story I'll go into at some other point. I'm not. My father's a Protestant preacher,
yeah,
but I was in a Jewish fraternity at university. I lived amongst Jewish students. I know they have a range of views, even then in the 80s. I
yeah,
know that continues to be the case. There is a very prominent former academic at the University of Bristol who's one of the biggest conspiracy theorists about a worldwide Zionist conspiracy.
okay,
And he used to preach this in his classes at Bristol when there were Jewish students who were there. And the Jewish students quite said, look, we feel threatened by this. He's saying we're part of a Zionist conspiracy to run
yeah,
the world,
yeah.
right? The upshot of it is that lecturer is no longer at the University of Bristol. He now works for Press TV,
Oh,
which is the
wow,
official outlet for Iran's regime.
wow,
Uh, and if you look up a program called Palestine Declassified, which is supposedly about Palestine,
hmm.
you'll see this former professor from the UK, spouting all this conspiracy theory on all this program. And so that's really important to me to make that point in the sense of saying that I think it's responsible, personally, on the one hand, to criticize the Israeli government's mass killing of
Yeah,
Gaza civilians
yeah,
and to do it on a day-to-day basis. And then on the other hand, to refrain from simply saying all Jews are like
yeah,
this in the
yeah,
same way,
yeah,
that we wouldn't say that all Muslims are
yeah,
part of some type of oppression by an Islamic government like
yeah,
Iran,
yeah,
or indeed that all Hindus are part of whatever policy the Indian government might pursue
yeah.
if we find problems with that.